Well, Alireza Firouzja keeps violating the rules of chess, doing things that people have taught chess players not to do for decades and decades and decades, yet seems to be doing okay. Our game today is a perfect example of that. This is a game against Teimour Radjabov, who was rated 2765 at the time of the game, and Firouzja is rated 2759. The event is the Magnus Carlsen Invitational, the preliminaries. Both sides have 15 minutes to play the game. Alireza has the white pieces. Radjabov has the black pieces. Let's begin. D4 is Firouzja's choice of opening. Knight f6, knight f3, g6. Radjabov plays his King's Indian that he's known so well for playing. c4, bishop g7, knight c3, castles, e4, d6, bishop e2, e5, castle, and knight to c6, the absolute main line of the Mar del Plata structure of the King's Indian. d5 kicking the knight, knight e7, knight e1, so the knight can move forward to d3 to support a c5 push. Knight d7, allowing the pawn at f7 to advance to f5, hit the base of the pawn chain, and also adding some control over the c5 square. Knight to d3, f5, f3, f4. And here is a move that Alireza has been experimenting with good results. The main idea here is to play the bishop to d2 to clear the back rank between the rook, two rooks and the queen, and also to leave the c1 square open for the rook, which is usually a square it wants to be on. But Firouzja just goes right ahead with b4. The idea, of course, is to support the c5 push, g5, aiming for the g4 break, c5, and rook to f6 is what Radjabov chooses to play. Knight f6 is the most common move. Rook f6 is actually the fifth most commonly played move here, but it has scored well, but only between games of fairly lower-rated players. The idea is that black can play rook to h6, perhaps queen to e1, h5, and if h3 is played, the bishop at c8 can sacrifice itself for the pawn. You have a very fast attack on the h-file. Firouzja, of course, is not going to let that happen, but that's the sort of the idea behind the rook f6 maneuver here. a4, rook to g6. He decides to use that rook to help support the g4 push. King to h1, and this is the game's novelty. And this is what I'm talking about when it comes to violating the rules of chess. Now, king to h1 isn't that uncommon in the King's Indian, but usually it's to tuck this dark squared bishop to the g1 square, but it has no access to this square. Here, the idea is completely different. He's going to move the rook to g1 and try to open the g-file. Well, the rules say you don't open lines on the side of the board where you're weak, where your opponent has space and pressure. Firouzja says, watch me. King to h1, a6. And this was a risky move from Radjabov. He's sort of doing the same thing, but it doesn't work. He's moving a pawn on the side of the board where he's weaker. But this just makes it easier for Firouzja to open up lines. Perhaps he wants to keep this c3 knight out of the b5 square, but he probably regretted the decision to play a6. Rook to g1, continuing that plan of opening the g-file. Knight f6, knight f2 to help control the g4 square. Now knight to h5, aiming for possible tactics on g3 or simply trying to prevent white from playing g3 and opening the g-file. The problem is it just doesn't work. He can go ahead and carry out his plan, Firouzja can, anyway, and he does. He plays g3, opening lines on the side of the board where his king is, where he lacks space. Rook to h6, lining up the rook against the king. King to g2, moving away from that alignment of pieces. The knight goes back to f6, and now a5. The reason he plays a5 is he wants to take on d6 and then play the knight at c3 to a4 and b6, which would fork the rook and the bishop, and then take that bishop. Because anyone who knows this structure knows that black's most important minor piece is his light squared bishop. That's how he would break any light square blockade white wants to create on the king side. So this maneuver of a5 with knight a4, knight b6 after cd6 is his way of getting rid of black's most important minor piece. Queen to e8, queen shifts to the h-file. Rook to h1, queen to g6. Again, deciding to leave it opposite the king. cd6, cd6, and now knight a4. Just as we said, aiming for the b6 square, which would get the light squared bishop off the board. fg3, hg3, rook takes h1, queen takes h1, and now g4, trying to open up lines against Firouzja's king. He goes right in with knight to b6, as we said, rook to b8, and here Firouzja plays rook to a3, which sort of lines up against that f pawn where black might capture and try to open up lines, or he could play the rook to c3 here, taking advantage of the open c file. The problem is that rook a3 is a little slow. Computers show us that a little more precise move was queen to h4, putting maximum pressure on that g4 pawn, and after, say, gf3, bishop f3, if queen to f7, bishop to g5, and rook can go to h1, white has all those pieces, and it would, in fact, be Firouzja with the strong kingside pressure in this position, a real reversal of what you would expect in this Mar del Plata King's Indian. But he plays rook to a3, h5, now queen h4, gf3 check, bishop to h3. And the best move for black in this position is to play bishop to g4. Firouzja has not captured that bishop at c8. He was doing other things. And in this position, white is better, but black can still play on a bit. But instead, Radjabov makes a mistake, makes a blunder. He plays bishop to h6, challenging that bishop at c1. And that makes sense from a strategic point of view, but it doesn't work tactically because of this idea, and Firouzja sees the right maneuver. He plays bishop takes h5, which hits the queen, but the knight or queen can capture it. But after knight takes h5, bishop takes h6, and Radjabov's king is very open and is in real trouble. And you notice that Firouzja is also threatening this knight on this square. So if, for example, queen h6, then queen takes e7, and here he would be far too actively placed to survive. And it is, again, Radjabov's king, which is in much bigger trouble, and white would just be winning in this position. So instead, Radjabov plays queen to f7, trying to defend that knight on e7, but you see that queen is completely overloaded. Firouzja plays rook to f3. Now, what does the queen do? The queen is having to defend the knight at e7, the knight at h5, and the square on f8. Rook f8 check is threatened, and the queen is under attack. And that's too much. And Radjabov resigned in this position with his queen overloaded. Just can't defend everything, and that was it. Really a thought-provoking performance from Alireza Firouzja. Maybe we should be analyzing how we play chess and some of the rules we've been following all these decades. Maybe they weren't as hard and fast as we thought they were. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.